This Game Boy Advance console is fitted with the latest IPS screen from a company called HISPEEDIDO, or at least I think that's how it's pronounced. It's the first time, to my knowledge, that I've installed one of their kits, but this one has an absolutely killer feature that I just had to try out for myself. It's something that's sure to make it a huge hit with modders, in particular those who are relative newcomers to the hobby. You see, this is what's called a drop-in solution, and it's about as easy as it gets to install, in theory at least. All you have to do is open up your console, remove the screen unit, and then replace it with this one. That's it. No cutting of the shell to make space, no careful linking or folding of delicate ribbons to line everything up, no soldering of any wires in order to be able to control it. It literally just drops in place. But that doesn't by any means make it a basic product. It's a brand new backlit 3-inch IPS display with a laminated glass panel on the front, guaranteeing a complete absence of any dust between the screen and the lens. The glass gives a crystal clear view of the screen, which is right up against the lens with no perceptible gap, adding to the already excellent viewing angles. It has capacitive touch controls to select from 15 levels of brightness, 8 different colour modes and 4 different display modes. And for more experienced modders, there's the optional step of adding a single soldered wire to be able to change the display settings using the original brightness button on the console itself. But is all this just too good to be true? In this video, I'll take a detailed look at the kit, guide you through the full installation process and demonstrate all the features of the product once it's working. I'll review the pros and cons and let you know what I think in terms of how well this seemingly perfect kit delivers on its promises. Hi and welcome back to the shed. I'm Joe Bleeps, and even just a few short years ago I never thought we'd see the day when you could get a brand new IPS display that you could simply drop into the shell of a Game Boy Advance SP after removing the original screen, with no 3D printed brackets to line it up, no cutting of the shell to make space, no connecting together fiddly delicate ribbons or soldering tiny wires to even tinier connection points. It sounds unlikely, but this kit here does exactly that. And to top it off, it's got built-in touch controls to make a whole load of adjustments to the display with a total of 480 different possible combinations of the settings. What can I say? I was curious, so I worked it out. Anyway, I bought the kit from the always excellent Z Labs in the UK. If you're thinking of buying one of these kits for yourself, then please use the link I've left in the description, as it also helps out my channel, and you can use the code JOEBLEEPS at the checkout to get yourself a nice 5% discount on your order. That said, I bought this kit with my own money, and I'll be offering my own opinions in an honest and practical fashion, just like always. So, can this kit really be that easy to install? And is it any good? There's got to be a catch, right? Let's take a look. So this is one of my Game Boy Advance SP consoles. I replaced the shell a while back with this orange Naruto themed one that came with these lovely dark blue buttons, and it looks really nice. But as you can see from the light grey screen when it's powered down, it still contains the front-lit AGS 001 style display, which in 2003 was a step up from the original Game Boy Advance because, well, that one had no lighting at all. But in reality, it's very difficult to see this screen clearly in any light, and the colours tend to get washed out, making it a less than ideal display. So I'm keeping the shell with the console for this project, so I won't need to remove the hinges. But if you're using a new shell with the kit and you want to know how to remove the hinges from the Game Boy Advance SP, I designed a tool to help with that. I'll link to the video here to walk you through that part of the process if you need it. So in this video, I'll open up my console and replace the screen with this HISPEEDIDO drop-in display. It's a self-contained unit with a single ribbon attached to it already. It comes with an optional wire that you can solder in place to connect the ribbon to the brightness button on the motherboard, but the kit works fine without completing this step. More about that later. There's a protective film cover on the glass lens that comes attached to the front of the screen, and if you look on the back, you can see the 2 touch sensors that enable the display to be adjusted when it's installed in the console instead of having to use the brightness button. What I'll do in this video is wire it up anyway, so I can show you the difference between the 2 different methods of adjusting the display, and you can decide what might be best for you. It's a somewhat chunky unit compared to other IPS kits I've used in the past, but it's actually about the same thickness as the original screen, so it fits in place easily. I suspect this metal casing on the rear might actually contain all the ribbons and adapters that you'd normally have to connect fold and solder stuff together yourself. But with this kit, it's done for you and neatly tucked away inside this housing with just one ribbon coming out that connects to the motherboard. When I looked at the ribbon, I noticed there were 2 solder points near the end, and to make sure they didn't have different functions, I used my multimeter on the continuity setting to confirm they were indeed both the same. So if you decide to solder the wire, you can connect it to either of these 2 points. Tool wise, it's worth having a couple of spudgers for lifting parts out or undoing small clips, and I needed a small tri-wing bit and a small Phillips bit for my screwdriver to dismantle and reassemble the unit. First, undo the screw on the battery cover with a Phillips screwdriver and use a spudger to carefully lever the battery up and lift it out of the shell. This will leave 6 tri-wing screws exposed that you'll need to remove next, a small one in both the cartridge slot and the battery compartment, and longer ones at each of the 4 corners. After that, you can carefully lift off the back of the console. The power button will probably drop out, but with any luck, the shoulder buttons should remain connected to that part of the shell. Next, we need to remove the motherboard, which is held in place with 3 little screws. When you lift out the motherboard, do it carefully because the ribbon from the screen will still be attached to it at that point. Some of the buttons and silicone membranes will fall out at this point, but put them to one side and remove any others that remain, as well as the speaker and its dust cover. It's at this point that you'll need to remove the screen ribbon from the motherboard. It's easiest to do this with the other half of the shell kind of held upright while you use your spudger or a fingernail to disengage the plastic catch from the ribbon housing at each end. It's a lateral movement, so don't try and lever anything up. Once each side of the clip pops out from the housing, the ribbon will slide out easily. I hope all that makes sense. After that, it's time to remove the screen by accessing the 5 tri-wing screws that are hidden underneath these little rubber covers around the edge of the display. If you're keeping the original shell, be very careful at this stage. With a third-party shell like this one, it's a lot easier. Either way, use the pointed end of a spudger, or being extra careful, you could use the sharp point of a knife to get into the gap and lever the covers out of these little recesses. You'll want to avoid coming into any contact with the soft plastic of the shell, and in my experience, even a stubborn one of these will lift out if you push a knife into it from the edge at a slight angle and carefully lever it up. Good luck, because you don't want to damage these. Once they're all removed, again, put them in a safe place for later and remove the 5 remaining screws. After that, keep the plastic parts held together with your fingers and carefully close the hinge. Looking from the underside, you'll see one final Phillips screw hidden under the ribbon. Remove it, and then you'll be able to take off the hinge cover from the other side. You'll see how the screen ribbon kind of loops over itself before it's slotted through the gap in the shell. The ribbon of our new kit will need to be looped in the same way, and you can gently roll it up to prepare it. To keep it even, you could wrap it around a round pencil or something similar, but do be careful because the ribbon is very delicate. Before going any further, it's recommended to do a test on the screen for any defects before installing it. Simply put the connector in place on the motherboard and then carefully align the battery with the 2 sprung contacts on the back, then switch on the console. Hopefully your display will come on with no problems and you'll be fine to carry on with your project. It's time to take out your old screen. Slip the end through the narrow gap in the shell, lift it out and move your old screen to one side. Before installing the new screen, peel off the protective film because you won't be able to do that later. This will expose the Game Boy Advance SP logo, which isn't perfect, but it's not bad at all. The screen will go face down into the housing and should fit really neatly. After this, carefully loop your ribbon and feed it through the slot, starting with the narrow bit at the end and then gently arrange the looped ribbon in the hinge area. There is self-adhesive backing on the lens that will help keep the screen secure in place once reassembled, so you can peel that off now. I found it easier with tweezers, but do be careful you don't scratch the back of the lens because that will show up on the front. Now to start reassembling the top half. Put the lid in place first, then making sure the ribbon is in position and won't get pinched, put the hinge cover back in place and screw it in position. Make sure to use the slightly longer Phillips screw for this one that secured it in place originally. After this, carefully open the hinge holding the frame and the lid together and then put the 5 short tri-wing screws in place. If you're feeling confident, you can put the screw covers back on, otherwise you might want to make sure everything is working well before committing. Now the next bit, I'll be honest, is a little fiddly, and that's connecting the ribbon to the motherboard. Thankfully, the length of the ribbon is quite generous and it's enough that it reaches fairly well, especially if you leave the hinge open. Just take your time. It's easy to get it to slot in place. The tricky bit is pushing the two ends of the clip in place, and I didn't get a great angle of that when I was filming, so sorry. I should really design a printable tool to make this easier, but in this case I used a couple of fingernails, and in the end it all went together fairly easily. Now, just in case you haven't got it seated perfectly, it is worth having another test at this point to see if it still works. When I switched mine on, I noticed a bit of an uneven brightness around the top and upper left portions of the display. I thought they might be under too much pressure, and I loosened the screws a touch on these areas, but they didn't really make a difference, so I forged ahead anyway. Next, and you can totally skip this part without missing out any of the main functionality, I added a wire to connect the brightness button on the console to the new screen. If you've soldered before, it's a fairly easy job, and if you're new to soldering, I advise you to try it anyway. It's great fun. It's easiest to lay the motherboard flat and use something else to prop up the rest of the console so there's no strain on the ribbon. First, prepare the surfaces with flux to help the solder flow better, then heat the pad with the tip of the soldering iron and add a little solder while it's still heating. You should end up with a small blob of solder on both the ribbon connector and a point on the motherboard marked Q12B. To make connecting the wire even easier, it's worth heating the ends and adding a little bit of solder to that too. Before connecting the wire, a little bit more flux won't do any harm. I'm left-handed, so I brought the wire in from the right and soldered on the left. If you're right-handed, you might want to flip this arrangement upside down and use the other hand. I'm using a simple 18-watt Antec CS18 soldering iron here with a fine tip attachment, and it did the job well. Carefully line up the wire with the blob on the ribbon and then reheat the solder to let it flow together. It'll make a neat connection but allow it to cool, and do the same with the other end of the wire to Q12B. Now, while I could have cut the wire shorter and stripped it down for a neater fit, I wanted to take the easiest route for this demonstration, so I left the wire at full length, rerouted it to a position away from any screw holes or white areas where the silicone membranes go, and then used a little bit of capped on tape to keep the wire in place while I was reassembling the console. After that, you can replace all the buttons and silicone membranes as well as the speaker with its dust cover before carefully lowering the motherboard in place. Put the 3 short Phillips head screws in place to secure the motherboard. Now, don't forget to put the power switch in place and then set it to off before putting the rear shell in position. If it's proving awkward, start with the shoulder buttons and give them a little bit of a wiggle until the pins pop in place, and then the rest of the shell should locate together pretty easily. Then put the 4 longest tri-wing screws back in at the corners before securing the shorter ones in the battery compartment and the cartridge slot. If you still haven't put the screw covers back in place around the screen, it's easiest to do that now, after which you can close the hinge, put the battery in place and relocate the battery cover, securing it in place with the Phillips head screw. So switch on for a test and everything should be working fine. If the screen looks dim, don't worry, you probably just need to adjust the brightness. So on to testing and explaining how all these controls work. So I tried it out with original Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games to see what effect the different settings had on the games from different systems. So first of all, the touch controls. Don't worry, there's no need to get fingerprints all over the screen. It's actually done by touching the plastic at the border. The right sensor is positioned just slightly to the right of the SP part of the logo. Simply tap it repeatedly to increase the brightness. It does only go up and not down, so it does go straight back to 1 after going all the way up to 15, which can make it a little bit frustrating if you're trying to get it up to the highest brightness. Also, if you accidentally touch the sensor and you're already on the highest brightness, everything's suddenly going to go dark. But that said, it's easy enough to turn it back up with a few taps if this happens. Now, if you press and hold the same sensor and wait a few seconds, it'll start to cycle through the 4 display modes: default mode, retro pixel, vertical scan lines, and horizontal scan lines. Release your finger when it cycles to your preferred selection. They all look pretty good, so it's just down to personal preference which one you go for. The left sensor is in line with the gap in the hinge below the AD of Advance. You press and hold it and the screen will start to cycle through the 8 different color modes. Again, simply release your finger to make it stop on the one you want. Now, at first I wasn't very impressed with the color modes. The original Game Boy games looked a bit weird in anything other than option 2, which is the monochrome setting. It looks a lot like the Game Boy Pocket. As for the Game Boy Advance, it's a color console anyway, so at first I couldn't see the point in having different color settings on a console that's color anyway. But then when I was in a dialogue analog screen in Metroid Fusion, it hit me. It's less a case of applying a different color palette each time, and more like having a different color overlay. And with green, blue, pink, yellow and purple tints to the overall display, this could quite literally be a game changer for people with visual stress and or dyslexia, playing for long periods of time staring at a tiny screen, especially if you're playing a text-heavy game. This could make a real difference. I also found that although the overlay did look a little bit odd at first, my eyes became used to them very quickly and didn't even notice the colour tint after a while. There's just less of a harsh contrast to the display. I'm going to try it out on a longer gaming session and see how it goes. Now, this isn't something I've really heard talked about in relation to these kits before, so I thought I might as well raise it here, as I know it could well be a strong selling point for a lot of people out there. Now, there's plenty to keep you happy right there, but if you went all out and soldered with the wire, you'll be rewarded with a little bit extra. The brightness button cycles through the 15 different levels of brightness in the same way the right touch sensor works, but if you press and hold it, you're greeted with an on-screen display. Unlike the funny playing ones I've tried before, which have BRT, CLR, DSP and FRM, you're given full words here for the most part, with brightness, color mode, pixel effects and FRM displayed on this model. Once the menu is up, single taps will cycle through the setting increments and a long press changes which option you're adjusting. FRM relates to frames and can simply be switched on or off, and as far as I can tell, it's intended to smooth out the animation or scrolling in certain games. If I'm way off the mark there and you know a bit more about this feature, please let me know in the comments. I struggle to find anything online. If you long press again, you get the option to do a factory reset to the default settings. Otherwise, you leave it for a few seconds and don't press anything, and the on-screen display goes away. It keeps your settings saved, so when you switch off, there's no need to make all these selections every time you switch your console back on, which is great. I did a side-by-side comparison with the original backlit AGS 101 screen that came fitted in later revisions of the console, and the IPS looked really good alongside it. It's a 3-inch screen as opposed to the original 2.9 inches, which sounds like it'd be negligible, but in practice it does look a lot bigger, and it's nice to have a smaller bezel around the screen too. I tweaked the settings of the IPS kit to try and get as close as I could to the 101 screen at maximum brightness, and I found that a brightness set to 13, color mode 1, pixel effects 2 was a pretty good comparison. However, on the higher brightness settings, it absolutely eats up the battery, and I found a brightness setting of 8 or 9 to be plenty bright enough while playing and keeping that 101 aesthetic. Speaking of batteries, I highly recommend picking up one of Helder's 800 mAh batteries at the same time as ordering your screen kit. I did, and it lasts a lot longer than the original battery, and you won't need to charge it quite so often. Again, these are available from Z Labs, and I'll leave a link for the battery in the description too. As I mentioned earlier, on my unit, there's a slight bright spot in the upper left area of the screen at the very edges. It's only really that noticeable when the screen is set to maximum brightness, or there's a solid black or white display, such as the initial boot screen. I've spent a good few hours playing Metroid Fusion, and it's only really when the screen cuts to black between different scenes that I started to notice it. It is a bit disappointing, but the overall colour, brightness, picture quality, it's all excellent, and in the grand scheme of things, the advantages of this kit far outweigh any disadvantages. So for the sake of having something so easy to install with so many easily accessible display settings, I would still absolutely recommend it. I would be curious to hear from anyone else who's tried this kit to see what their experiences were like in terms of installation, playtesting and battery life. Speaking of my playtesting, I've spent plenty of time this week playing Metroid Fusion, which is one of my all-time favourite games. I love it. Now, I've completed this game countless times, so I'm very familiar with the visuals, and I have to say it looks absolutely stunning on this screen. Bright, deep colours, loads of crisp detail. I am having a blast playing through it on this console. Absolute handheld perfection. So that's it, an excellent screen with such a straightforward installation process. It should serve as an excellent introduction to people just getting into modding Game Boys. I really like that despite having the touch controls, they still include the option to solder in the extra connections if you fancy a little bit more of a challenge. Amazing to be able to do a straight swap upgrade to the screen of a console that's recently celebrated its 20th birthday. I feel so old. In other news, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very excited to announce a partnership with Z Labs. Now, I've been a customer of theirs for a long time now. They sell so many awesome and useful modding parts and spares for a wide range of consoles on their website, as well as tools and equipment that you might need to get you started. If you buy any of the product from their site through the affiliate link in the description here, I'll earn a small commission, which helps out my channel, as well as bringing custom to Z Labs and supporting a small business. To add to that, if you use the code JoeBleeps, you'll get a 5% discount off your total at the checkout, no matter what you choose to buy. I've been working hard to improve my channel this year, and I am super grateful to Z Labs for their support. I bought a whole load of stuff for upcoming projects that you'll see over the next few weeks. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Whether you're new here or you're following my channel already, likes and comments are always appreciated. And if you'd really like to help this little channel keep growing, subscribe and sign up for notifications. I'm trying to post a new video every week at the moment, so it's good to stay up to date. This is Joe Bleeps signing off from the shed. Should be some more videos popping up here if you want to keep watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.